There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house on a Sunday afternoon. The kind that wasn't always there. Maybe it used to be filled with footsteps at the door, the smell of coffee being made, the sound of his voice asking what's for lunch. And now the chair is empty. The phone doesn't ring the way it used to. And somewhere between the wedding and this moment, something shifted, and you're not entirely sure what. If that quiet sounds familiar, I want you to know something before we go any further. You are not being dramatic. What you're feeling isn't weakness, and it isn't something you should just push aside and get over. The grief of losing closeness with a child you raised, a child who is still alive, still out there, is one of the loneliest feelings a parent can carry. I've been a psychologist for over 40 years. I have sat across from hundreds of parents, most of them mothers, but fathers too, who came into my office carrying that exact grief. And almost every single one of them started with the same question. What did I do wrong? Today, I'm going to answer that question honestly. Not to assign blame, not to you, and not to your son, but to give you something more valuable than blame. Understanding. Because once you understand what is actually happening, psychologically, developmentally, relationally, you stop reacting from pain and start responding with wisdom. And that shift? That is where the door back to your son begins to open. I'm going to walk you through 5 specific reasons why married sons pull away from their parents. And for each one, I'll give you a concrete, practical strategy, something you can actually do. Stay with me until the 5th reason. In my experience, it's the one most parents never see coming, and often the one that matters most. Before we get to the 5 reasons, I want to offer you a frame. When your son got married, something happened that most parents don't have a name for, but that every developmental psychologist understands clearly. His attachment system reorganized. Now I know that sounds like academic language. Let me make it simple. From the time he was born, you were his primary bond. His safe harbor. The person his nervous system was wired to return to when the world felt uncertain. Then he fell in love. And that primary bond, slowly, naturally, and necessarily, began to transfer. Erik Erikson, one of the great psychologists of the 20th century, described this as one of the central developmental tasks of early adulthood, building intimate partnership. And he was right. It is a task. A healthy one. One that every well-adjusted adult needs to complete. What that means in practice is that your son is not abandoning you. He is building something. And those two things, building something new and abandoning what came before, are not the same. They can feel the same from where you're standing, but they are fundamentally different. There's also a cultural gap worth naming here. Many of you were raised in a time and a family culture where it was understood, without question, that family came first. Always. Sunday dinner wasn't optional. Calling your mother wasn't a choice. Being present for your parents was simply what you did. Your son was raised in a different America. One that tells young people, build your own life, establish your own home, make your own rules. Not out of selfishness, but out of a cultural shift in what it means to become an adult. Neither generation is wrong. But that gap between what you expected and what he was taught to do, that gap has a cost. And right now, you may be the one paying it. So, let's look at what's actually driving the distance, and what you can do about it. Reason 1. His wife's family has a different gravity. I want you to imagine a simple equation. Your son and his wife have, on average, somewhere between 50 and 80 discretionary hours a month. That's the time left over after work, sleep, errands, and the basic business of running a household. Now 2 families are making a claim on that time. Yours and hers. Add in holidays, birthdays, and the occasional crisis on either side, and what you're looking at isn't a loyalty test. It's a math problem. And here's what makes it harder. In many marriages, the gravitational pull of the wife's family tends to be slightly stronger in the early years. Not because she loves her family more, but because the home they're building tends to be emotionally organized around her comfort and her sense of belonging. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how most young households work. The mistake many parents make at this stage is to interpret the division of time as a message about love. If he really cared, he'd find a way. We gave him everything. The least he could do is show up on holidays. I understand why it feels that way. But that framing turns a scheduling problem into a moral failure, and that framing will push him further away, not bring him closer. Here's what actually works. Make your home the low-pressure option. When every visit comes loaded with unspoken expectation, we haven't seen you in 3 weeks, you know we're not getting any younger, your father misses you even though he won't say it, your son's nervous system begins to associate coming home with emotional labor. And people avoid what feels like labor. Remove the weight. Replace obligation language with genuine invitation. Not, you should come this Sunday, but, we'd love to see you whenever it works. That is not passive. That is strategic. The family that feels easiest to be around is the family that gets the most time. Reason 2, you may be competing with his wife without realizing it. This is the reason most parents resist the hardest. Not because it isn't true, but because it doesn't feel true from the inside. There is a dynamic in family psychology called triangulation. In the specific context of a mother, a son, and a daughter-in-law, it looks like this. 2 people pulling on one person in opposite directions, and that person gradually retreating from both to find peace. Most parents who fall into this pattern are not doing it consciously. They are not trying to compete. They are simply expressing love in the only language they know. But here's what that love can sound like to a daughter-in-law. A comment about the way she keeps the house. A comparison, even a gentle one, to how things were done before. A phrase as innocent as, "He never used to like that," or, "That's not how we did it in this family." These aren't attacks, but they land as territorial claims. And when a wife feels that her home, her choices, or her husband are being subtly evaluated, she pulls back. And when she pulls back, he follows. Not because she's controlling him, but because he is trying to preserve the peace of the home he is building with her. Here is the strategy that changes this dynamic more powerfully than anything else I've seen in 40 years of practice. Stop trying to win your son. Start trying to win his wife. I don't mean insincerely. I mean genuinely invest in that relationship. Ask about her interests. Learn what she cares about. Find something real that you appreciate about her and say it, not to be strategic, but because it's true, and because you've been withholding it out of quiet competition. She is not the enemy. She is the keeper of the home your son lives in. And when she feels safe with you, genuinely, not performatively safe, the door opens. Reason 3. Your visits feel like an emotional obligation, not a joy. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. The last few times your son visited, how did those visits end? Did he leave relaxed, having genuinely enjoyed himself? Or did he leave tense, slightly relieved, already bracing for the next time? In my clinical experience, one of the most common and most painful patterns I see is this. Parents who love their children deeply, whose homes are full of that love, and whose visits have still somehow become events their children dread. Not because of anything catastrophic, but because of accumulation. The quiet guilt trip when he gets up to leave early. The question that isn't really a question. So you won't be here for Easter again this year? The advice about his job, his weight, his finances, offered with love, received as judgment. The remark about how little they hear from him anymore, delivered just as he's putting on his coat. Each of these, alone, is small. Together they create what I call the grievance gap, the distance between what you feel you're owed as a parent and what he feels he's able to give as an adult son. When that gap is visible in every interaction, visits begin to feel like a toll booth. He pays the toll, and then he leaves. The strategy I recommend here is what I call the best 90 minutes rule. The next time he visits, commit to making that visit extraordinary, not in length, but in quality. Feed him something he loves. Ask him about something he's excited about. Don't bring up frequency. Don't mention how long it's been. Don't give advice unless asked. And end it. End it warmly. End it early, before the tension has a chance to arrive. Leave him thinking, that was actually really good. That thought is more powerful than any guilt trip ever written. Because people return to places that feel good. And right now, your job is to make sure that your home is one of those places. Reason 4. He set a boundary, and you didn't hear it. Boundaries, in psychology, are not walls. A boundary is a communication. It says, this is where I end and you begin. This is what I need to feel safe in this relationship. Healthy adults set them. Healthy relationships honor them. But here is what I've observed repeatedly in parents of adult children, especially parents of sons, a remarkable inability to hear the boundary when it's being set. Not out of cruelty, out of love. Because when you love someone deeply, their limit can feel like rejection. And rejection is painful. And painful things are sometimes easier to dismiss than to sit with. So he says quietly, Mom, I'd prefer if you didn't comment on my diet. And the next visit, you comment on his diet. Not because you forgot, but because you didn't register it as a real limit. You registered it as sensitivity, as something he'd get over, as something that didn't apply in the context of a mother's concern. He registered it as evidence that you don't listen. And here is what unheard boundaries do over time. They don't disappear. They calcify. They become the invisible architecture of the distance between you. The strategy I call replay and respect. Think back over the last 3 or 4 interactions with your son. Did he say something, anything, that functioned as a request for you to stop, to back off, or to do something differently? Write it down if you need to. Look at it clearly. Then, the next time you speak to him, name it. Not in a dramatic way. Just simply, I've been thinking about what you said a few weeks ago. I think I didn't take it seriously enough. I'm going to do better. That sentence, offered without defensiveness, without qualification, can do more to reopen a closed door than months of overtures. Because what it communicates is the rarest thing in any relationship. I hear you, and you matter enough for me to change. Reason 5. He doesn't know how to be a husband and your little boy. This is the one. Of all 5 reasons, this is the one I've watched do the most quiet, consistent damage to the relationship between a mother and her married son. And it's the one that's hardest to talk about because it comes directly from love. When your son was small, you had a name for him. Maybe you still use it. A nickname. A particular way of addressing him that carries the whole weight of his childhood in a single syllable. And when you look at him, this grown man with a mortgage and a wife and responsibilities you didn't give him, sometimes you still see the boy. The one who needed you. The one who came to you when he was hurt. The one who was, for a time, entirely yours. That memory is sacred. I'm not asking you to let go of it. But I am asking you to consider what happens when a man who is working hard to establish himself as a husband, as the head of a household, as an adult, walks into a space where he is still treated as a child. Where conversations begin with, "Are you eating enough?" Where achievements are met with, "That's wonderful, honey," in a tone that lands like a pat on the head. Where his opinions are tolerated rather than genuinely considered. He doesn't know how to be both things at once. And when the pressure to be your little boy conflicts with his need to feel like a man, he chooses the role that his daily life requires. The one that makes him feel capable, respected, and whole. And he does that, increasingly, somewhere else. Here is what brings him back. See the man. Not the boy you raised. The man he became. Ask him what he thinks about something that actually matters. His field, the state of the country, a decision you're facing. And then listen. Not to indulge him, but because his perspective has genuine value and somewhere deep in him, he's waiting for you to recognize that. Update your language about him. When you talk about him to others, or to him, speak about his life as it is now, not as it was. His current work. His current interests. His current self. The greatest gift you can give a grown son is the experience of being truly seen, not remembered, but seen, by the parent who has known him longest. That gift is irreplaceable. No one else can give it. Not his wife. Not his friends. Not his colleagues. Only you. And when he feels it, when he walks out of a conversation with you and thinks, she really gets who I am now, he will come back. Because home is not a place. Home is the feeling of being known. Let me bring these 5 reasons together. Notice what they have in common. None of them are about your son not loving you. Every single one of them is about friction that built up slowly, quietly, in the space between what you needed and what he could give. Friction can be reduced. That is the good news. But it requires something that doesn't come easily after a lifetime of being the parent. It requires you to move first. Not because you were wrong. Not as an admission of failure. But because you are, in this moment, the wiser person. And wisdom acts. Viktor Frankl, a man who understood suffering more deeply than almost anyone in history, wrote that we cannot always choose our circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. You cannot control how often your son visits. You cannot control the gravitational pull of his wife's family or the way marriage has reorganized his priorities. What you can control is the quality of what he finds when he returns. Here is my practical request for you. Take the 5 reasons you heard today. Identify one, just one, that felt most true, most familiar, most uncomfortable to sit with. That one is your starting point. Don't try to fix everything. Don't have a long conversation. Don't present him with an apology that turns into a list of grievances. Just pick one thing. Practice it for 60 days. And watch what shifts. Because change in family relationships is almost never dramatic. It is quiet. It is gradual. It is the accumulated weight of 100 small moments that each say in their own way, I am learning. I am trying. You matter to me enough for me to change. I want to come back to that quiet house. That empty chair. It is still there. And here is what I want you to know about that chair. It is not a symbol of loss. Not yet. Not while he is still alive, and you are still here, and the possibility of closeness still exists between you. That chair is an open door. The pain you feel when you look at it, that is love with nowhere to go. And love with nowhere to go is not a weakness. It is a resource. It is the energy that, properly directed, can rebuild what distance has worn down. You are not powerless in this. You are not disposable. You are not a chapter of his life that is simply over. You are a parent learning, perhaps for the first time, what it means to love an adult son on adult terms. To love him not as the child who needed you, but as the man who is still becoming. To hold space for him without filling it with expectation. That is harder than anything you did when he was small. And it is more important. If something in what I shared today hit close to home, if you found yourself recognizing your own household, your own patterns, your own particular version of that distance, I want to ask you not to defend against it. Just sit with it. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that you're a bad parent. It is the sound of a bridge being built. If this conversation was useful to you, please share it with someone else who might need it. Subscribe to this channel for more honest, research-based conversations about the relationships that matter most in the years that matter most. And leave a comment below. Tell me which of the 5 reasons felt most familiar. You may be surprised how many others share your story. Take care of yourself. And keep the door open.